Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 10 about media and politics. It's Lesson 2 about the news media. In this lesson, you'll learn about hard news, about opinion journalism, in the previous lesson, you learned about the idea of mass media. That is, some sort of mechanism used to convey information to large and widely distributed audiences. We also talked about specific types of mass media. Newspapers, magazines, books, films, radio, television, websites, and social media are all ways to convey information to broad audiences. We now want to talk about the most common form of political mass media, which can be carried over really any of those mechanisms described on the previous slides, and that is news. Oftentimes, news and political information are one and the same. So let's talk about different types of news media. In other words, the sort of programs or stories that may appear on the news. The first of those is what we can call hard news. Hard news is presented as simply giving us the facts of a situation. It's presented as being unbiased, neutral, simply telling us the truth of what happened. Some examples of this are two types of television programs. One is the evening news broadcast. An example of that is ABC World News Tonight. On these sorts of television programs, we get short news stories about what's happening in the political world. Oftentimes the stories are just 1 or 2 minutes long before moving on to something else. Another example is the news magazine show called 60 Minutes. On 60 Minutes, we get much longer versions of stories. These longer versions are deeper and more detailed than what you would get on an evening news program. But in either case, whether the story is 2 minutes long on the evening news or 20 minutes long on 60 Minutes, it's presented as being a fact-based recitation of what is happening in the political world. Even though it's presented that way, hard news may actually at times be inaccurate or even biased. This is something that we'll talk about later on in this unit. But for right now, just realize that hard news is presented as simply being the neutral truth, but it isn't necessarily always that. The second type of news media we want to talk about is opinion journalism. Opinion journalism, unlike hard news, is built around debating what the facts are. So instead of presenting it neutrally as just this is what's happened in the world today, instead you're going to have some sort of discussion about what is true or isn't. Some examples of this are in the magazine form, the magazine Mother Jones, or in television, cable news programs like the O'Reilly Factor. What happens in these sources is you have someone presenting what they believe to be the truth, perhaps confronted by and debated or interviewed by somebody else. So maybe you have, for example, the host of the O'Reilly Factor present his view of what's happening, or perhaps he brings on a couple of guests and have them debate with each other about what's happening. What's happening for you as the viewer when you view or read these kind of things is you are getting an argument about what's taking place in the world, rather than it being presented to you as simply a neutral observation. Opinion journalism is the most common form of primetime show on cable news. There are several cable news channels: Fox News, MSNBC, Headline News, CNN, and during the primetime hours, what we're talking about is 7 or 8 o'clock at night, depending on what time zone you're in, till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Those primetime hours are filled with these kind of shows. Now, opinion journalism is oftentimes shallow and misleading compared to hard news. The reason is you've got people trying to prove their point rather than educate the viewer. And in trying to prove their point, they may twist things a little bit or be incomplete in their explanations, omit certain facts or whatever it may be to strengthen their point of view, and thus leave the viewer not getting the entire story. A third type of news media is what we can call pseudo news. Now, what pseudo means is fake, but that's not quite what we mean here. Instead, we mean sort of news, kind of news. Pseudo news sacrifice facts to be entertaining. Here are a couple of examples of this. Each weeknight on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, he comes out and begins his show with an opening monologue where he talks about current events. So he's talking about the news, oftentimes political news. But he does it with a humorous spin. He's making fun of what's happening in the world. Another example is the news satire show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, which airs on HBO. This is presented as sort of like a hard news program, but it's not really. Instead, it's John Oliver making fun of what's happening in the news. So really, in both cases, it's sort of like we're getting the news, but it's done with an intentionally humorous slant to it. Now, the obvious potential problem with pseudo news, since it's people making fun of what's happening in the news, is that we aren't going to be informed about what is really happening. In fact, the story of what's happening might be twisted, might be completely deceptive, just to make the jokes work. But there's a good side of the pseudo news also, and that is that for some people, this may be their only contact with political news. In other words, without these comedians presenting these things that they could laugh at, they simply would not be exposed to what's happening in the world. So while this might not be the best exposure for them, at least it is some exposure. So while perhaps ideally we would all watch the hard news, and perhaps ideally we wouldn't get caught up in the opinion journalism, and perhaps ideally we wouldn't be misled by pseudo news, all these things work together to help the population be informed at least somewhat of what's going on in the world. But in every case, there's the danger of being misled by the bias of the presenters and by their agenda of what they're trying to accomplish, perhaps win an argument or simply make a joke. Now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What is an example of a hard news program? Is it ABC World News Tonight? Is it The O'Reilly Factor? Is it The Daily Show? Or is it Real Time with Bill Maher? An example of a hard news program is ABC World News Tonight, where they're at least claiming that they're simply presenting an unbiased neutral unbiased neutral view of the important things happening in the world. What type of program dominates cable news? Is it opinion programming, hard news, pseudo news, or news magazines? Cable news programs are dominated by opinion journalism. In other words, you get people on programs who argue and disagree and debate with each other. And that's what viewers seem to like to watch. That's what gets the good ratings. And so that's what most cable news shows, at least in the evening primetime hours, are filled with. What is a positive aspect of pseudo news? Is it that it always tells the truth? That it provides in-depth coverage of the issues? Is it that it's the only source of news for some people? Or is it that it's unbiased? The good thing about pseudo news is that it's at least giving some people some exposure to the news that they otherwise would not have. All right, that completes Lesson 2 from Unit 10. The next lesson from Unit 10, Lesson 3, will be about popular media.